The Pakistani offensive at Assault Uttar failed because a bold armored idea met a battlefield that steadily took away the conditions required for success. That explanation may sound simple, but it is more useful than any single cause legend. The thrust toward Khem-Karan and beyond was not foolish merely because it failed, and it was not defeated by one weapon, one heroic act, or one lucky event. It failed through the interaction of terrain, delay, reconnaissance problems, imperfect combined arms, Indian defensive preparation, and the difference between possessing strong tanks and using an armored formation effectively. The battle rewards careful analysis because it shows how armored warfare actually works. Victory came from a chain of reactions meeting a chain of mistakes.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The Pakistani plan had a real operational logic. A strong armored thrust through Khem-Karan toward Beaky Wind, Harakeh, and the Bias Line could have created a serious crisis for India in Punjab. The objective was not merely symbolic. Roads and crossings beyond Khem-Karan mattered because they connected movement, supply, and defensive depth. If Pakistan's 1st Armored Division had broken through quickly and preserved momentum, Indian commanders might have faced a much more dangerous problem than the loss of a border town. For that reason, the plan should not be dismissed as absurd after the fact. It aimed at a vulnerability. Its failure came because the conditions required to exploit that vulnerability proved far harder to create and sustain than the plan assumed. The first major reason for failure was delay. Armored offensives depend on time in a brutal way. Every hour that passes without breakthrough gives the defender opportunities to withdraw, regroup, lay mines, register artillery, move reserves, and understand the shape of the attack. Pakistan needed speed after India widened the war in Punjab. Instead, the fight developed in stages that gave Indian forces time to pull back from Khem-Karan and build the defensive position around Assault Uttar. Delay did not have to be dramatic to matter. A slowed crossing, a confused report, a paused formation, or a cautious approach to uncertain ground could all contribute. In armored warfare, lost minutes accumulate into lost operational possibility. Terrain was the second major reason, and it is central to the battle's teaching value. The Khem-Karan sector looked more suitable for armor than the mountains of Kashmir, but that did not make it open tank country in practice. It contained cultivated fields, sugarcane, villages, irrigation channels, embankments, roads, and soft or waterlogged ground. Indian forces made some of this terrain worse for the attacker by using water and mines. The result was a battlefield that reduced visibility, channeled movement, and made cross-country maneuver risky. Tanks are not simply vehicles that go wherever commanders draw arrows. They are heavy machines that need passable ground, awareness, and routes. Around Assault Uttar, the ground narrowed the options of the attacker. Reconnaissance and battlefield understanding formed a third weakness. A fast armored thrust must know where the enemy is, which routes are open, where obstacles lie, and whether a withdrawal means collapse or preparation. Pakistan misread or underestimated the defensive system forming behind Khem-Karan. Indian movement backward could be interpreted as weakness, but it was also becoming a method. The defensive box around Assault Uttar was not obvious at every moment from the attacker's perspective, especially in crops, villages, and poor visibility. Once tanks advance without a clear picture, they may discover the defense only by running into it. That is the most expensive form of reconnaissance because the price is paid in vehicles, crews, and lost tempo. The fourth reason was combined arms friction. Pakistan's tanks were dangerous, but tanks need infantry, engineers, artillery, reconnaissance, air support, recovery, and supply to turn danger into decision. In close country, infantry must protect tanks from hidden anti-tank weapons and clear villages or field positions. Engineers must handle mines, obstacles, and bad ground. Artillery must suppress defenders at the right moment. Recovery and maintenance must keep the formation from shrinking as vehicles break down, bog, or take damage. At Asal-Uttar, these elements did not work smoothly enough to maintain the offensive rhythm. The tanks carried too much of the battle's burden, and when tanks are forced to solve every problem themselves, their strengths begin to erode. Indian preparation was the fifth and perhaps most visible reason. The withdrawal to Asal-Uttar was not simply a retreat. It was the beginning of a deliberate defensive answer. Indian commanders traded exposed ground for time and depth. Engineers laid mines, water was used to soften fields, artillery was organized, infantry held villages and approaches, and armor was placed to fire from better ground. The result was not a perfect fortress, but it did not need to be perfect. It needed to slow, channel, confuse, and expose the attacking armor. This is what good defensive preparation does against tanks. It does not always stop the first vehicle at the first line. It makes the formation fight worse with each movement forward. The Indian use of armor was also important. The battle is sometimes remembered as Pattons versus Centurions, but the actual story was more complex. Older Shermans of Deccan Horse helped break the early momentum at dangerous range. Centurions of 3rd Cavalry gave the defense heavier anti-tank power at the moment when Pakistani movement had already been constrained. Indian tanks were effective because they were used within the defensive system rather than thrown into an open contest of prestige. They fired when the attacker was slowed, exposed, or predictable. That is a crucial lesson. A defending tank does not have to win a race. It has to appear where the enemy's movement has already been made costly.
Infantry made that armored defense possible. Positions around Chima, Asal-Uttar, and nearby villages prevented Pakistani armor from treating the defensive zone as empty ground. Infantry protected mines and anti-tank weapons, observed movement, held local strongpoints, and complicated the relationship between Pakistani tanks and their supporting troops. The story of Abdul Hamid and other anti-tank actions matters because it shows how a small weapon could have large effects when the terrain and defensive system created the right opportunity. But infantry's contribution was broader than any one action. It anchored the battlefield. Without infantry holding ground, Indian tanks and artillery would have had fewer stable points around which to organize their fire. Logistics and recovery added another layer to the failure. Armored divisions consume fuel, ammunition, spare parts, track life, road space, and command attention at an extraordinary rate. A breakthrough requires not only tanks at the front, but supply columns and recovery vehicles able to follow through danger and congestion. When tanks bog down, are disabled, or block routes, recovery becomes urgent and hazardous. If damaged vehicles cannot be recovered, losses rise and routes become more cluttered. If fuel and ammunition cannot arrive smoothly, the offensive loses endurance. These problems are less dramatic than tank duels, but they are central to operational success. At Asal-Uttar, the more the battlefield slowed Pakistan's armor, the more logistics became part of the trap.
Command judgment must also be considered, though it should not be reduced to hindsight blame. Pakistani commanders faced pressure to restore initiative after India widened the war, and the promise of a deep armored thrust was attractive. But the operation required a clear sense of when to push, when to pause, how to read Indian withdrawal, and how to keep all arms coordinated through a confused battlefield. Indian commanders faced their own severe risks, especially in withdrawing from Kemkaran and holding a hastily built defense. Their key success was recognizing that they could not meet the Pakistani offensive on the terms Pakistan wanted. They changed the terms. Command at Asal-Uttar was therefore not only about issuing orders, it was about understanding what kind of battle was actually being fought.
The offensive also failed because morale and psychology shifted. At first, Pakistani armor carried confidence, and Indian defenders faced the intimidating approach of a stronger-looking armored force. But as the attacks slowed, as Pattons were hit or trapped, and as the defensive box held, confidence moved in the other direction. Pakistani crews and commanders had to worry about mines, hidden tanks, anti-tank teams, soft ground, and unclear routes. Indian soldiers, having survived the first blow, could see that the plan was working. This does not mean fear vanished for the defenders or courage vanished for the attackers. It means that the emotional rhythm of the battle changed, and in war, that rhythm can influence how quickly units move, decide, and endure.
The failure of the offensive should not be explained as technology defeated by backwardness or as equipment defeated by bravery alone. Pakistan's Pattons were capable tanks, and Indian soldiers did not beat them by ignoring their danger. They beat the offensive by denying those tanks the conditions they needed. Better equipment can widen possibilities, but it cannot overcome every failure of ground, coordination, intelligence, and timing. Likewise, courage is essential, but courage without preparation can be destroyed. Asal-Uttar mattered because it brought these truths together. Indian courage worked because it was joined to a defensive system. Pakistani equipment failed because it entered a battlefield where its advantages were steadily reduced. In the longer arc of armored warfare, Asal-Uttar belongs beside many battles where the promise of breakthrough collided with the reality of combined arms. Since Cambrai, tanks had offered armies the hope of restoring movement to battle. By 1965, they were stronger, faster, and better connected by radio, but they still depended on the same essentials: passable ground, fuel, maintenance, reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, engineers, and command tempo. The Pakistani offensive failed because too many of those essentials broke down at the decisive place and time. India won because it adapted quickly enough to attack the offensive's dependencies rather than merely its vehicles. That is the enduring lesson. Asal-Uttar was not magic. It was armored warfare, explained in the hardest possible classroom.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.